The music academy was buzzing with the usual energy of a weekday morning. The hallways echoed with the sound of footsteps and muffled piano notes leaking from practice rooms. Some students were hurriedly moving between lessons, sheet music clutched tightly under their arms, while others sat quietly at benches, fingers tapping along to rhythms only they could hear. Among them was a young piano student, smaller than many of the others, carrying a notebook that was already filled with practice notes, finger exercises, and sketches of melodies that danced in their mind. Today felt different. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, a quiet tension that made even the birds outside the window seem unusually still. The student knew this morning would be memorable, but they couldn't quite put their finger on why. When they stepped into the main practice room, the teachers were already there, standing with that familiar mix of expectation and scrutiny that always made the heart beat a little faster. "You're ready for something new," one of the teachers said, glancing at the student with a smile that didn't quite hide the seriousness in their eyes. The student nodded, trying to hide the flutter of nerves in their chest. Music had always been their safe place, the one corner of the world where the chaos of school, friends, and life outside melted into patterns and sounds. But there was a challenge waiting now, one that felt larger than anything they had faced before. The teacher pulled out a piece of sheet music, sliding it across the table. The student froze for a moment, taking in the page. The composition was dense, every line filled with notes that seemed to leap and twist across the page, demanding a level of skill that made the stomach twist with anxiety. The piece had a reputation among the students and teachers alike. It was considered nearly impossible to play perfectly, even for experienced pianists, and yet here it was, handed directly to the student. The eyes of the other students in the room widened. A few whispered to each other, exchanging looks that ranged from curiosity to doubt. Some didn't even try to hide their disbelief. The student could feel it, the weight of everyone's expectations, both spoken and unspoken. Their fingers itched to move, to press the keys, but at the same time, they felt frozen by the enormity of the task. "This is going to be challenging," the teacher continued, "but I think you're ready. Remember, it's not about perfection at first, it's about understanding the music, feeling it and making it your own." The student nodded again, though inside, panic and excitement were colliding in a confusing jumble. They had tackled hard pieces before, but nothing like this. Every note seemed to demand more than they could give. And yet there was a spark of determination in their chest, a stubborn refusal to back down. They had worked hard for this moment, and somehow, deep down, they believed they could rise to the challenge. Practice began in earnest. At first, it was a mess of wrong notes and awkward rhythms. The fingers stumbled, hitting some keys too hard and others too soft. The student would stop, take a deep breath, and try again. Each repetition felt both frustrating and oddly rewarding, like stepping onto a rocky path that gradually smoothed beneath their feet. The teachers watched quietly, offering guidance here and there, a suggestion to slow down, a tip on finger placement, a reminder to pay attention to the phrasing. Meanwhile, the students' peers drifted in and out of the practice room, some sneaking glances at the sheet music, others stopping for a moment just to listen. The whispers continued. "Do you think they can really play that?" One student murmured. Another shrugged. "It's impossible. No one's ever done it perfectly." The words stung, but instead of breaking the students' focus, they lit a tiny fire of determination. They weren't just practicing for themselves anymore. They wanted to show that effort and heart could turn the impossible into something real. Days turned into weeks. Early mornings and late nights were filled with the sound of scales, arpeggios, and the relentless repetition of tricky passages. Each mistake was dissected, corrected, and played again. The student learned to listen not just to the notes, but to the gaps between them, to the rise and fall of each phrase, to the emotion that hid within the music. Slowly, very slowly, the piece began to feel less like a mountain and more like a puzzle waiting to be solved, but it wasn't easy. There were nights when fatigue made the hands ache, when the rhythm refused to settle, and when the music seemed to mock their efforts. During those moments, the student would sit at the piano long after everyone else had left. staring at the sheet music as if willing it to make sense. They questioned themselves, wondered if they were truly capable, and sometimes allowed themselves a few quiet tears. Yet beneath the frustration, there was always a small voice urging them to try one more time, to push just a little harder. The teachers noticed the determination. One day, after a particularly grueling practice, one of them said, "You have something most students don't. It's not just skill, it's heart. Keep that, and you'll find a way through this." Those words lingered in the student's mind, becoming a kind of mantra during the long hours of practice. It wasn't enough to play the notes correctly. They had to make the piece alive, to breathe life into the music and let it tell a story only they could tell. Outside of practice, life continued as usual. Friends invited the student to hang out, to relax, to take a break, but the pull of the piano was stronger. Even in moments of distraction, thoughts of the piece would creep back, haunting them in a way that was both daunting and inspiring. Every tiny success, finally nailing a difficult run, catching a rhythm that had been impossible before, felt like a small victory. Proof that the impossible was slowly bending toward reality. One afternoon, a fellow student stopped by the practice room, curiosity written all over their face. "You've been at it for hours every day. Don't you ever get tired?" they asked. The student smiled, though it was tinged with exhaustion. "Sometimes," they admitted, "but I feel like if I stop, it'll just keep being impossible. I have to see it through." The peer looked at the sheet music and shook their head. "That's crazy, but I kind of admire it." That simple acknowledgement, small as it was, filled the student with renewed energy, a reminder that perseverance was visible even to those who didn't fully understand the struggle. Slowly, subtle changes began to emerge. The clumsy mistakes were less frequent, the rhythm more stable, the melodies richer and more expressive. The student could feel the music starting to flow naturally through their fingers, no longer a series of disconnected notes but a conversation between their heart and the piano. It was still hard. There were days when it felt as though the piece was laughing at them, but progress, however small, kept piling up. The teachers began to notice too. During one observation, one of them paused mid-sentence and said quietly, "I didn't think this was possible so soon." The student just smiled, cheeks flushing, because they knew the truth. It wasn't magic. It was countless hours, countless retries, countless moments of stubborn refusal to give up. It was the small victories, the tiny improvements, the refusal to let frustration win. By the end of the first month, the student could play long stretches of the piece without stopping, though not perfectly. They had learned to anticipate tricky parts, to slow down when necessary, to focus on phrasing and emotion rather than just notes. More importantly, they had learned something far beyond music: the value of persistence, patience, and self-belief. The impossible was no longer something to fear. It was a challenge to meet head-on. One morning, as sunlight poured into the practice room, the student sat at the piano and began to play. The first notes were cautious, familiar, but then they grew bolder, more confident. The music filled the room, weaving through the air like a story being told for the very first time. For a moment, the student forgot about perfection, about the skeptical whispers, about the difficulty of the piece. There was only the sound, only the movement of the fingers, only the heartbeat of someone daring to reach beyond what they thought was possible. And in that moment, they understood. This wasn't just about conquering a piece of music. It was about discovering a strength they hadn't known they possessed, about feeling capable even when others doubted, about finding a voice that could rise above fear. The journey was just beginning, but the student was ready. The impossible was no longer a wall. It was a path, and they were determined to walk it, note by note, heart by heart. The days after the first encounter with the impossible piece were filled with a mix of excitement and dread. Every morning, the student arrived at the practice room earlier than usual, the sheet music still neatly tucked in its folder, the piano waiting like a quiet challenge. The room was empty at first, silent except for the faint hum of sunlight through the windows and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. Sitting down, fingers hovering over the keys, the student could feel the weight of the task ahead. Every note seemed to carry a tiny whisper of doubt. Can you really do this? The first attempts were frustrating. The fingers didn't move the way the mind imagined. Runs that looked easy on paper twisted and tripped. Chords that should have been simple were awkward and uneven. The music felt like a puzzle with pieces that refused to fit. It was tempting to give up, to push the sheet music aside and pretend the challenge didn't exist. But the student knew that giving up would leave only regret. Instead, they closed their eyes for a moment, breathed deeply, and tried again. At first, the practice was slow and deliberate. Every measure was played carefully, sometimes over and over, until the hands remembered the right movements. The student's eyes scanned the notes constantly, watching for patterns, listening to every sound, correcting every tiny mistake. The process was exhausting, both physically and mentally, but also strangely satisfying. There was something thrilling about wrestling with a difficult task and refusing to let it win. The teachers visited occasionally, observing from the doorway, their expressions serious but encouraging. "Don't rush," one would say. "Listen to the music. Let it guide your fingers." Another would add, "Focus on small sections at a time. You don't have to conquer it all at once." Their advice was simple but powerful. It reminded the student that even the most daunting challenges could be broken into smaller steps, each step bringing them closer to mastery. Despite these strategies, there were moments when frustration threatened to take over. Fingers would fumble, rhythms would collapse, and the music would feel like an unsolvable tangle. On one particularly difficult evening, the student played a passage repeatedly, each attempt worse than the last. Head in hands, they muttered under their breath, "Maybe I can't do this. Maybe it really is impossible." For a moment, despair felt overwhelming. Then, as if drawn by some unseen force, the student remembered the first time they had touched the piece. The first time the music had felt like more than just notes on a page. They remembered the spark of curiosity, the determination to see what could be achieved. Slowly, they lifted their hands back to the keys and tried once more, not expecting perfection, just progress. That small decision, to continue despite doubt, became a turning point. Days blurred together in a rhythm of practice, short breaks, and reflection. The student learned to observe their own playing more carefully. Sometimes they would record themselves on a small device, listening afterward to catch mistakes that had gone unnoticed while playing. Other times, they would slow the music down, separating complex passages into tiny segments and perfecting each one before moving on. It was tedious work, but gradually the pieces of the puzzle started to fit. The challenge wasn't just technical. The piece demanded emotion and expression as well. At first, the student focused only on playing the right notes. But the teachers reminded them that music was more than accuracy, it was storytelling. "Imagine the story behind these notes," one teacher suggested. "Feel the emotions. Let the piano speak for you." Slowly, the student began to experiment, letting their interpretation shape the music. The sounds that once felt rigid and mechanical began to breathe. The music started to feel alive, flowing naturally through their fingers. Outside the practice room, life continued with its usual distractions, but the student found that the piece was never far from their mind. During a walk through the quiet streets of the city, they imagined the rhythm echoing in their footsteps. During dinner, they hummed the melody under their breath. Even in the middle of school lessons, snippets of the music would float into their thoughts, reminding them of the challenge waiting for them. It became a constant companion, sometimes frustrating, sometimes comforting, but always inspiring. The journey was lonely at times. Some peers didn't understand why the students spent so much time practicing. "Why do you torture yourself like that?" one would ask. Others were skeptical. "You'll never play it perfectly," they whispered. But the student had learned to pay less attention to others' opinions. They were no longer playing to impress anyone but themselves. The music had become personal, a measure of their own growth and dedication. There were, of course, moments of joy. When a difficult run finally clicked or a tricky chord progression fell into place, the student would smile and feel a surge of pride. Those moments were fleeting but powerful, small victories that reminded them that progress was real, even if perfection remained distant. Over time, these tiny successes added up. The music began to feel less like an impossible mountain and more like a path, winding and steep, but navigable with patience and persistence. One afternoon, a teacher asked to hear the latest attempt. The student played, hands slightly trembling but determined. The performance was far from flawless, but there was a noticeable improvement. The fingers moved with more confidence, the rhythm held steady, and the music had a new sense of life. The teacher smiled, nodding slowly. "You're starting to understand it," they said. "It's no longer just a collection of notes. You're beginning to tell the story." Those words were like sunlight breaking through clouds. The student felt a mixture of relief and pride, realizing that all the hard work was starting to pay off. The struggle also taught patience. The student learned to accept that mastery couldn't be rushed. Some days, progress came quickly and the music seemed to flow effortlessly. Other days, even the simplest passages resisted every attempt. On those tougher days, the student reminded themselves that learning was not linear. Persistence mattered more than speed. Every repetition, every attempt, every mistake was part of the journey. As the weeks passed, the student noticed subtle changes in themselves. They were calmer under pressure, more focused, more resilient. The experience of wrestling with something so challenging taught them that effort could overcome fear. They realized that the sense of impossibility they had felt at the beginning was not a reflection of their ability, but a reflection of their mindset. With determination and careful practice, obstacles that once seemed insurmountable could be overcome. By the end of the second month, the piece no longer felt like a chaotic jumble of notes. Sections that once seemed impossible had begun to flow naturally. The student could play for longer stretches without mistakes, and the music sounded more expressive, more alive. Even when mistakes occurred, they were easier to recover from, as the student's understanding of the piece deepened. It was a transformation not just in skill, but in confidence. The student also began to notice changes in how others reacted. Peers who had been skeptical started to watch in silence, curiosity replacing doubt. Occasionally, someone would pause outside the practice room, listening as the music drifted into the hallway. A few even complimented the student, small acknowledgments that, while not the goal, were nonetheless encouraging. The student didn't need validation, but it was a reminder that effort and dedication could inspire others, even unintentionally. One evening, the student stayed late after everyone else had left. The hall was empty, quiet, and filled with shadows stretching across the floor. Sitting at the piano, they played through the entire piece slowly, carefully, and without interruption. The music filled the space, echoing off the walls, rich and full, carrying a sense of triumph that had nothing to do with applause. For the first time, the student felt a true connection with the piece. It was no longer an enemy to conquer, but a companion, a story waiting to be told through their hands. At that moment, exhaustion melted away, replaced by a deep satisfaction. The journey was far from over. There were still difficult passages, still imperfections, still a long road ahead. But the student had discovered something more important than technical skill: the power of persistence, the value of patience, and the importance of believing in oneself. Even when the odds seemed impossible, the piece that had once seemed like an unscalable mountain was beginning to feel like a challenge that could be met with focus, heart, and determination. Every mistake became a lesson, every success a reminder of how far they had come. The music was no longer a source of anxiety, but a mirror reflecting the student's growth and resilience. As they packed up the sheet music that night, the student felt a quiet confidence. Tomorrow would bring more practice, more challenges, and perhaps new frustrations, but also new triumphs. The journey through the impossible piece was teaching lessons that reached far beyond music. It was teaching courage, patience, and the quiet power of refusing to give up. And so, with the last notes still echoing in their mind, the student left the practice room, ready to return the next day, ready to face the challenge once more. The impossible was still ahead, but it no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a path, and the student was determined to walk it, one careful, deliberate, and heartfelt step at a time. By now, the student had spent weeks practicing the piece every single day. The piano had become almost like a friend, sitting silently in the corner of the practice room, waiting patiently for their return. Each morning they would walk in with a quiet determination, lift the heavy lid, and let their fingers hover over the keys, feeling the familiar weight of the challenge ahead. Every note had a story, every passage demanded attention, and every small improvement felt like a tiny victory. At first, progress had been slow, sometimes painfully slow. Weeks of repetitive exercises and careful practice seemed to result in barely noticeable changes. Yet the student had learned to appreciate the small steps. A single run played smoothly, a rhythm finally held steady, a chord struck with the right emotion. These moments began to add up. They started noticing subtle shifts in their playing. The music, once rigid and mechanical, now had a certain life, a flow that was starting to feel natural. It was during these moments that the student realized something important. Improvement didn't always come in big leaps. Sometimes it came quietly, almost unnoticed, like a tiny seed slowly growing under the surface. The more they practiced, the more the music began to feel like it was becoming a part of them. It wasn't just their fingers learning the notes, their mind, their heart, their whole being were starting to understand the rhythm, the emotion, the story hidden within the piece. Even so, the piece remained challenging. There were sections where the fingers would slip, where the rhythm would collapse, and where mistakes seemed inevitable. On particularly difficult days, the student would pause mid-play, leaning against the piano and rubbing tired hands. Frustration would bubble up, and the thought that maybe the challenge was too big would creep into their mind. But then, almost instinctively, they would shake it off, take a deep breath, and return to the keys. Each mistake became less of a failure and more of a lesson, a clue about what needed attention. A reminder to slow down, focus, and try again. One afternoon, as sunlight poured through the windows, the student tried a particularly difficult passage for the 100th time. The fingers stumbled over a sequence of fast notes, hitting wrong keys and losing rhythm. They stopped, closing their eyes and leaning their forehead against the piano. "Why is this so hard?" they muttered to themselves, a mix of frustration and disbelief in their voice. For a moment, it felt like the piece would never be conquered. But then, the memory of the first day returned, the feeling of fear and excitement when the sheet music was handed over, the moment when they had promised themselves to try no matter what. Slowly, the student opened their eyes, lifted their hands, and began again, slower this time, paying attention to each note, each pause, each rise and fall of the music. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and progress was worth celebrating. As the student continued, something remarkable began to happen. The music started to speak in a new way. Before, it had been a list of notes, something to get right or wrong. Now, the notes began to tell a story. The fast passages carried a sense of urgency. The soft chords felt gentle and introspective, and the long sustained notes seemed to breathe, rising and falling like waves. The student realized that they were not just playing the music, they were interpreting it, giving it life through their own hands, their own heart, their own experience. The teachers noticed these changes as well. During one observation, a teacher quietly entered the practice room and listened as the student played a particularly difficult section flawlessly. The fingers moved with confidence, the rhythm was steady, and the music flowed naturally. When the student finished, the teacher nodded with a small smile. "You're beginning to understand it," they said. "It's no longer just about playing the notes. You're telling the story behind them." Those words carried a weight the student hadn't expected. It was one thing to play correctly. It was another to truly connect with the music, to let it express something personal. Motivated by this realization, the student began experimenting more. They started to think about the emotions the composer might have felt, the scenes the music might be describing. Some passages sounded like quiet reflection, others like sudden bursts of excitement or tension. The student would pause after difficult sections, imagining the story and trying to convey it through touch, timing, and subtle emphasis. Slowly, the music began to transform, becoming not just a challenge to conquer, but a message to share. Even outside the practice room, the piece started to shape the student's daily life. Walking through quiet streets, The rhythm of the music echoed in their steps. At home, they would hum melodies quietly while doing chores, imagining different ways to express the music when they returned to the piano. Even simple interactions with friends or family were colored by the piece. When someone asked about their progress, the student would describe the journey in terms of small victories and lessons learned, realizing that the challenge had taught more than just piano skills. It had taught patience, resilience, and self-discipline. The students' friends noticed the change too. Some had been skeptical at first, thinking the piece was too difficult to ever master. Now they watched in quiet admiration as the student practiced day after day, seeing the determination and persistence that refused to be shaken by doubt or difficulty. Occasionally, someone would peek into the practice room, hearing the music and stopping to listen. Even without words, the student's progress was becoming an inspiration, showing that dedication and hard work could overcome challenges that seemed impossible. The journey was not without setbacks. There were days when progress seemed to stall, when mistakes came more often than successes, and when fatigue made the fingers ache. On those days, the student would remind themselves of the long path they had already traveled. They thought about the first day, about the fear and excitement that had filled them when the piece was first assigned. They remembered that initial spark of determination and used it to push through. Even when the music resisted every attempt. By now, the student had learned to break the piece into smaller sections, focusing on the most difficult passages first. They would practice these sections slowly, analyzing every movement, every finger placement, every tiny shift in rhythm. Once a section was mastered, it was connected to the next, gradually building up until the entire piece could be played more smoothly. It was painstaking work, but each small improvement was a reminder that the impossible was slowly becoming possible. Over time, the music began to feel less like a mountain and more like a journey. The student could anticipate tricky sequences, feel the rise and fall of phrasing, and express emotion in ways they hadn't imagined before. Mistakes still happened, but they were easier to recover from. The hands moved with more confidence, the ears listened more carefully, and the heart connected more deeply to every note. One evening, as the student practiced alone, they paused mid-piece and leaned back on the piano bench. The room was quiet, the only sound the fading echo of the notes. They realized how far they had come. What once seemed impossible was now within reach, not yet perfect, but no longer unattainable. The music had become a reflection of their persistence, patience, and courage, a testament to the hours of effort, the repeated failures, and the unwavering determination to keep going. It was during moments like these that the student understood something profound. Mastery wasn't just about technical skill. It was about connection, understanding, and interpretation. It was about taking the notes on the page and transforming them into something alive, something that carried meaning and emotion. And while perfection was still a distant goal, the journey itself had value, teaching lessons that reached far beyond the piano bench. Encouraged by these insights, the student pushed further. They experimented with dynamics, emphasizing certain notes to create tension, softening others to create moments of reflection. They practiced long stretches without stopping, building stamina and focus. Each practice session became an opportunity to explore, refine, and grow. The music was no longer just a challenge. It was a playground, a place to discover, experiment, and express. The teachers continued to support the student, offering guidance and encouragement, but now with a sense of admiration. They had watched the transformation from the first awkward attempts to the confident, expressive playing that was emerging. One teacher remarked quietly, "You're not just learning the music, you're becoming the music." The student smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about impressing anyone anymore. It was about connection, growth, and the joy of discovery. The student also began to notice how the challenge had changed them as a person. They were more patient, more focused, and more resilient. They had learned to embrace mistakes as opportunities for learning rather than sources of shame. They had discovered the value of persistence, the power of quiet determination, and the satisfaction of gradual progress. The experience had taught lessons far beyond music. lessons that would stay with them for a lifetime. By the end of this period, the student could play long sections of the piece without stopping, their fingers moving with confidence, their ears listening intently, and their heart guiding every note. The music flowed more naturally, carrying emotion, tension, and beauty. The day of the recital had arrived, and the student could feel the energy buzzing through the academy. The hallways were alive with movement, the soft shuffle of feet, and the faint rustle of sheet music. The air carried a mixture of excitement, nerves, and anticipation that made every heartbeat louder than usual. The recital hall itself was grand, with polished wooden floors, rows of seats that seemed to stretch endlessly, and a stage that looked both inviting and intimidating. It was a place where music could transform from notes on a page into something that touched hearts. And today, the student was about to bring their journey to life, backstage. The student adjusted their posture and took a few deep breaths. Fingers rested lightly on the keys of a nearby practice piano, as if warming up not just the hands but the mind and spirit. The sheet music had been rehearsed countless times, notes memorized, phrasing perfected, or at least, as perfected as it could be. Every passage, every chord, every rhythm had been explored, repeated, and refined. Yet, despite the preparation, there was still a flutter of nerves. The hall was full of teachers, fellow students, and parents, each waiting quietly for the performance to begin. The student closed their eyes for a moment, recalling the long hours of practice, the frustration, the small victories, and the moments when giving up had seemed tempting. They thought about the first day the piece had been handed over, about the way it had seemed impossible, and about the determination that had pushed them forward. That journey, every step of it, had prepared them for this moment. And now, all that remained was to bring it to life. When it was finally time, the student walked onto the stage. The lights were bright, the audience silent, and the piano waiting like an old friend. The heartbeat that had raced so quickly moments before seemed to settle into a steady rhythm, matching the pulse of the music that was about to begin. Sitting down, they lifted their hands to the keys and took one last deep breath. Then the first note rang out. The opening was cautious, careful, each sound deliberate. The student listened closely, guiding each finger, feeling the weight and flow of the music. As the piece progressed, confidence grew. The notes began to flow naturally, connecting passages that had once been difficult and awkward. The rhythms held steady, and the once challenging runs became a seamless part of the story being told. It was a transformation that had taken weeks of effort, and now it was finally visible to everyone in the hall. The audience was captivated. At first there was silence, the kind of attentive quiet that comes when people are drawn into something extraordinary. Then, as the music built, the expressions of those watching changed. Eyes widened in surprise, faces softened in appreciation, and subtle nods of acknowledgement spread through the crowd. The student could feel the attention, but instead of being intimidated, they felt energized. The music was no longer just about the notes, it was about communication, about sharing something personal and profound with everyone listening. Every difficult passage that had once seemed impossible was now being played with clarity and precision. Fast runs moved effortlessly across the keys, intricate rhythms landed perfectly, and long, expressive chords resonated throughout the hall. The students' fingers were guided not just by memory, but by feeling, by connection, by an understanding of the story behind each note. The piece was no longer a challenge to be conquered. It was a living, breathing expression of effort, emotion, and growth. Halfway through, the student encountered a particularly tricky section. For weeks, this had been the part that caused the most frustration, where mistakes had seemed inevitable. But tonight, something felt different. The hands moved confidently, the rhythms held steady, and the music flowed naturally. The audience, sensing the mastery and focus, leaned forward slightly, drawn into the unfolding performance. A quiet thrill ran through the student, a mix of relief and pride as they realized that the impossible was no longer impossible. It wasn't just technical skill that carried the performance. The student had learned to shape the music, to emphasize the rise and fall of emotion, to create moments of tension and release. Soft, reflective passages were played with gentle care, while louder, more dramatic sections carried energy and excitement. Each note, each pause, each subtle dynamic was intentional, a choice that reflected weeks of effort, reflection, and growth. The music was alive and the student was at the heart of it. Guiding it with focus, confidence, and heart. The teachers watched with admiration. They had seen the student grow from hesitant beginnings to a performer capable of capturing both the technical and emotional essence of the piece. Their expressions conveyed pride, surprise, and quiet awe. Some teachers whispered to each other, acknowledging that what they were witnessing was more than just skill, it was mastery born from perseverance, patience, and dedication. In the audience, other students were equally impressed. Some had doubted that anyone could ever play the piece well, yet here it was, unfolding flawlessly. Some felt inspired, imagining what they could achieve with similar determination. Others were moved, realizing that hard work, persistence, and belief could transform the impossible into something beautiful and achievable. Even parents, many of whom had not been familiar with the piece before, could sense the effort, skill, and heart that had gone into every note. As the piece progressed toward its climax, the energy in the hall grew. The music became more expressive, more dynamic, and more intense. The students' hands moved effortlessly, guided by a mixture of practice, intuition, and emotional connection. Each chord resonated, each run soared, and each pause allowed the audience to breathe with the music. The student had become one with the piece, their fingers and heart telling the story in a way that no words could convey. The final notes approached, long, sustained, and full of emotion. The student played each one deliberately, allowing the sound to linger, to resonate, and to fade naturally. The room seemed to hold its breath, captivated by the conclusion. And then, as the last note faded into silence, there was a pause, a moment of stillness where the audience seemed to process what they had just witnessed. Then, the applause began. At first, quiet, polite clapping, then growing louder and louder, until the entire hall was filled with appreciation. Standing ovations erupted in some corners, faces glowed with excitement, and the student, breathing heavily but with a deep sense of satisfaction, allowed themselves to smile. Every late night, every mistake, every moment of doubt had led to this moment. The impossible had been transformed into reality, and the effort had paid off in the most tangible, beautiful way. Backstage, teachers and peers approached, offering congratulations, praise, and admiration. "I've never seen anyone take on that piece like you did," one teacher said, voice filled with pride. "You didn't just play it, you brought it to life." Peers nodded, some in awe, some smiling, and a few even whispered quietly that they had been inspired to try harder in their own practice. The student nodded and smiled, feeling gratitude not just for the applause, but for the journey itself, the struggle, the effort, and the growth. As the hall began to empty, the student lingered by the piano for a few moments, reflecting on the experience. The challenge that had once seemed insurmountable was now behind them, replaced by a deep understanding of what persistence, focus, and heart could achieve. It was more than just a successful performance, it was proof that dedication could overcome fear, doubt, and difficulty. Walking out of the recital hall, the student felt a quiet confidence that they had not experienced before. The piece had been mastered not just through talent, but through determination, patience, and belief in themselves. The applause, the admiration, and the pride of those who watched were rewards, but the true reward was internal, a sense of accomplishment, growth, and understanding that would stay with them for life. That night, lying in bed, the student replayed the performance in their mind. Each note, each chord, each moment of expression floated through their thoughts. They realized that the journey through the piece had taught them more than music alone. It had taught resilience, focus, patience, and the value of consistent effort. It had shown them that the impossible was only impossible until someone decided to meet it with heart and determination. In the days that followed, the performance was remembered by teachers and students alike. The story of the once impossible piece being played with skill and emotion spread through the academy. Some students were inspired to challenge themselves, others reflected on their own efforts, and everyone learned a quiet lesson about perseverance. And for the student, it was a turning point of confirmation that hard work, patience, and courage could transform even the most daunting challenges into triumphs. The experience also left a sense of calm confidence. The student understood now that challenges, no matter how difficult, could be faced and overcome. It wasn't about being perfect or flawless or the best. It was about effort, heart, and the willingness to push through doubts and fears. The music had become a mirror of their own growth, and the lessons learned would resonate far beyond the piano bench, influencing every challenge they faced in life, even months later. When practicing new pieces or facing new challenges, the student would remember that recital the way they had transformed fear into. The recital hall had long since emptied, leaving behind only the faint echo of applause and the lingering warmth of lights that had once illuminated the stage. The students stayed for a few moments, standing by the piano, letting the quiet settle around them. It was a calm, reflective silence, the kind that only follows a moment of great effort and achievement. The hands that had danced across the keys were still, but the heart remained full, brimming with the mixture of relief, pride, and something more profound, understanding. As the student carefully packed away the sheet music, their mind replayed every moment of the performance. The first hesitant note, the tricky passages that had once felt impossible, the rising confidence in the middle of the piece, and the final sustained notes that had filled the hall with sound. All of it came rushing back, vivid and real. The applause, the smiles, the admiration in the eyes of teachers and peers, it was overwhelming in the best way possible. But beyond the recognition, the student realized that the true reward had been in the journey itself. The days after the performance were filled with congratulations and quiet reflections. Teachers approached with kind words and encouragement. "You've grown so much," one said, a gentle smile on their face. "Not just as a pianist, but as a person. That piece was once impossible, and now you've made it your own." The student listened, smiling softly, understanding that the praise was meaningful, but not the measure of success. Success had already been achieved in every hour of practice, every mistake corrected, and every moment of persistence that had led to the final performance. Friends and fellow students approached as well, some with awe, others with curiosity. Many asked how it had felt to play the piece, and the student realized how much they had changed through the experience. At first, the piece had been a source of anxiety, something that seemed far beyond their abilities. Now, it was a testament to what could be accomplished through determination, patience, and heart. The impossible had been met, and the memory of that achievement would stay with them forever, even after the applause faded and the hall returned to its normal quiet. The student noticed a shift in the way they approached music and challenges. Practicing new pieces no longer seemed intimidating. Mistakes were no longer a source of frustration, but opportunities to learn. The experience had taught that progress is often slow and difficult, but that every small improvement matters. Each lesson learned during the journey of the impossible piece had left a lasting mark, shaping not just musical skill but character and resilience. At home, the student reflected on the journey, replaying the memories in their mind. They remembered the first day the piece had been assigned, the fear and doubt, the countless hours of practice, and the moments of frustration and near despair. And yet, they also remembered the small victories, the runs that finally flowed smoothly, the chords that landed perfectly, the days when everything clicked for a few magical moments. Those moments had built confidence, courage, and self-belief. They realized that the performance had been the culmination of much more than practice. It had been the result of persistence, patience, and the refusal to give up. No matter how impossible the challenge seemed, the experience also left the student with a deeper understanding of themselves. They realized that challenges, no matter how daunting, could be met with focus and determination. They had discovered a strength they hadn't known existed, a capacity for patience, resilience, and creative problem-solving. The impossible piece had become a mirror, reflecting the student's growth, courage, and dedication. And the lessons learned through this process, were far more valuable than any applause or recognition. Teachers noticed the transformation as well. The student had become an example of what dedication could achieve, not just in music but in life. Other students looked to them as a source of inspiration, seeing firsthand the results of consistent effort and focus. Some approached the student, asking for advice on how to tackle difficult pieces or how to stay motivated during long hours of practice. The students shared their experiences humbly, encouraging others to embrace challenges and to see mistakes as part of the learning process. With time, the student began to approach music differently. The focus shifted from merely learning notes to understanding emotion, expression, and storytelling. Each piece became a journey of its own, a story to interpret and bring to life. The experience with the impossible piece had taught them to listen more carefully, to feel more deeply, and to connect with the music in a way that was personal and meaningful. It was no longer about impressing others, it was about expressing themselves and sharing something real through the piano. The impact of the journey extended beyond music. Challenges in school, life, and relationships were approached with a new mindset. The student had learned that perseverance, focus, and belief in oneself could overcome obstacles that at first seemed insurmountable. Difficulties were no longer feared. They were opportunities to learn, grow, and discover new strengths. The lessons of patience, resilience, and heart carried far beyond the practice room, shaping every part of the student's life. One day, a younger student at the academy asked to watch the performance of the piece. The student agreed, eager to share not just the music but the story behind it. As the younger student listened, wide-eyed and inspired, the older student explained the journey, the fear at the beginning, the hours of practice, the frustration and mistakes, and finally, the triumph of playing the piece in front of an audience. It wasn't just about the music, it was about the journey, about learning to face the impossible and discovering strength along the way. Sharing the story reminded the student of how far they had come. They remembered the quiet evenings spent alone at the piano, the repeated mistakes that seemed never-ending, and the small victories that had built up over weeks and months. They realized that the journey had been as important as the performance itself. It had taught them discipline, focus, patience, resilience, and self-belief, lessons that could be applied in any area of life, even months later. The student would occasionally revisit the piece, not out of necessity, but out of love for the music and respect for the journey. Each time they played, they were reminded of the transformation that had taken place. The piece was no longer impossible, it had become a symbol of perseverance, growth, and the power of heart. It was a reminder that challenges, no matter how daunting, could be met and even surpassed with dedication and belief. The academy itself had changed slightly as well. Teachers referred to the student's achievement as an example of what could be accomplished with effort and heart. Peers were inspired to practice more diligently, to embrace challenges rather than fear them. The story of the impossible piece being mastered spread quietly, becoming a source of motivation and hope for others. And for the student, it was a humbling reminder of how personal growth could have a ripple effect, inspiring others without even trying. Looking back, the student understood that the journey had been as much about personal growth as about mastering music. They had learned to manage frustration, to focus under pressure, and to approach challenges step by step. They had discovered the value of persistence and patience, and the satisfaction that comes from achieving something that once seemed beyond reach. These lessons were not temporary. They would last a lifetime, shaping how the student approached every new challenge. One evening, as the students sat quietly at the piano, they reflected on the journey from the very beginning. They remembered the moment the sheet music was first handed over, the fear and anxiety, the self-doubt, and the whispers of impossibility from peers. They remembered the long hours of practice, the repeated mistakes, the moments of frustration and tears. And then they remembered the breakthroughs, the small victories, the growing confidence, and finally, the triumphant performance in the recital hall. It was a journey full of emotion, effort, and discovery, a journey that had changed them forever. The student realized that the performance had been just one part of a much larger story. The journey had taught them to value effort over perfection, to see mistakes as opportunities, to trust themselves, and to approach challenges with courage. It had shown them that impossible things were often only impossible until someone was willing to meet them with heart, determination, and patience. And it had shown them that the journey itself, the struggles, the persistence, and the small victories was as important as the final achievement. In the weeks and months that followed, the student continued to practice, explore, and grow. The lessons learned from the impossible piece informed every new challenge, every new piece of music, and every new obstacle in life. The student had learned that effort and heart mattered more than talent alone, that patience and persistence could overcome fear and doubt, and that the joy of discovery and growth was one of the most rewarding experiences life could offer. The story of the journey, the performance, and the personal transformation became a quiet inspiration for others, showing that dedication and belief could turn even the most daunting challenges into triumphs. And for the student, it was a lifelong reminder that the impossible could be faced, conquered, and transformed into something beautiful, meaningful, and unforgettable.